Hello everyone and welcome yet again to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in to the show. Happy Wednesday everyone. We're at the midway point of the week and this show should be an exciting one for this occasion. We're going to be discussing the Euros midweek recap in terms of fantasy. We are going to be looking at specifically the Spain-France semifinal that took place yesterday. What a game we had there. Then we're also going to be looking at the 2024 NHL draft class and determining which rookies, especially those like Celebrini and Levshunov, who were taken at 1 and 2 overall, are going to make an impact in terms of fantasy hockey. And we'll also be looking at the DeMar DeRozan trade. As we all know, he is now a Sacramento King. We're going to look at what that means for the Kings as a team in both betting odds and in terms of fantasy value. And last but not least, we're going to finish off with two very boom or bust player profiles, if you will. Before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you guys to like, follow, and subscribe to the show if you are so willing. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and the network, so consider doing that. Also, we do receive a ton of tips and donations as well, so if you do feel so inclined, please leave them at the link, gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support as well to both me, my fellow podcasters, and the network as a whole. So anything you leave is greatly appreciated. You can also leave any burning questions, comments, or concerns about the show and any of its prior segments, or even segments on today's show, and they will be answered and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let's jump right into today's episode, starting off in the Euros. We had a very exciting game yesterday in the semifinals of the tournament between Spain and France, two very different styles. France looking much more pragmatic and defensively solid. Spain wanting to utilize those two young wingers, those two electric wingers, and Nico Williams and Lamine Yamal to the best of their abilities to gain a sense of further attack. And ultimately, that ideology won out. The combination play of Lamine Yamal and so many different players who are just increasing their work rate for a Spanish side who refuses to die. Spain ultimately comes out victorious. And before we go into any of the Euros fantasy stars, I just want to preface this with saying that even though we've talked about this player before, it is no doubt in my mind, there is no doubt in my mind that Dani Olmo is the player of this tournament. He's reminiscent kind of a Federico Chiesa in the Euros in 2021, where he didn't necessarily have the biggest role in the squad, but he certainly had the most important part of the squad. And many can say that without his creativity and intelligence on and off the ball, they might not even be at this point. They could have been knocked out by Germany. But Dani Olmo being in the squad for Spain gives them a different alternative than just relying on Nico Williams and Lamine Yamal to go forward. But ultimately, those two have reacted well to the pressures, the burdens being placed on their shoulders in this tournament, especially yesterday. And we start off our Euro Fantasy Stars with Lamine Yamal, the young 16-year-old, youngest player ever now to score at a European Championships, and what a goal it was to tie the game. At this tournament, Lamine Yamal has been perhaps the best, not just in real life, but in fantasy as well. With 1 goal on 16 attempts, so as you can see, he's always looking to either get a shot off or find a teammate. With 3 assists, 80.34% pass accuracy, and 30 successful dribbles in this tournament. So Lamine Yamal, a lot of weight is being placed on both him and Nico Williams' shoulders at such a tender young age, and they are rising to the occasion. Obviously, they've had their kind of topsy-turvy games in the tournament, Germany being an example. But still, when asked to deliver, Lamine Yamal has been the catalyst for the Spanish side. Without him, they really lose a certain dynamic that really makes them tick. And who knows what they would have looked like if a different player was on the wing than Lamine Yamal. And now let's look at France. Obviously, France have always played this tournament-style football where they sit in and they rely on their forward players to counterattack and make opportunities on the break. And in transition, they're frightening to watch. But this tournament truly was the exception for them because they saw what they had in defense. Deschamps saw it, and he said that we should build around that because obviously a lot of these players are tired, and international football can tend to get a little bit dicey at times when, there's a lot of fatigue in your squad. And so he relied on a very solid back line that, to that point, had not conceded more than 2 goals in a game. And a lot of credit has to go to defenders, but specifically one man in particular, in between the sticks, and Mike Maignan. Mike Maignan had a very impressive tournament. His first true tournament as one of the goalkeepers for France who they can rely upon for years to come. 16 saves, 4 clean sheets, 84% pass accuracy, 4 punches, and 8 claims overall for Mr. Mike Maignan. When all is said and done, I think that he could win the Golden Glove Award for Best Goalkeeper at this tournament. He truly brought a sense of calm and composure to the French defense because you had a young guy in William Saliba paired with a more experienced veteran in Deo Upamecano, kind of playing in a familiar situation as he's been in the Bundesliga. But ultimately, Mike Maignan, being as impressive as he was, not necessarily called upon as much as people would think, but he got the job done for France. Kudos to France for playing and sticking with their defensive identity and doing what they do best, but ultimately they fell up short against a far superior team in terms of attacking prowess and how they approach the game, more importantly. Now we transition back to Spain, and there are a lot of players here who are seen more as role players in the squad. They're not necessarily the big names that's going to steal the headlines every single day, but they are metronomic presences that you can't necessarily drop at any given time because of the fact they really bring this team together and creates that attacking identity that just adds a little bit more extra verve to what Spain can do. And one of those players reminiscent of that ideology is Fabian Ruiz. Now, Fabian Ruiz has never been a midfielder who's gotten enough attention. He's bounced around a couple places, suddenly ending up at PSG, having a solid domestic season, albeit not necessarily a goal-scoring threat. But at the European Championships, he's looked like a man transformed. 2 goals, 2 assists, 90.4% pass accuracy, 15 attempts, and 10 dribbles. As for someone who, is seen as more of an attacking midfielder, but in a Spanish squad who really wants to allow their midfielders to focus on distribution of the ball out wide, he really has been someone who, when the Spaniards have needed service from guys like Lamine Yamal and Nico Williams, Fabian Ruiz has often found himself very much on the end of it. He had a great chance again yesterday in the France game, did not see it go in, but ultimately he's been the guy who has been on the end of a lot of Lamine Yamal assists, and he's just been a very underrated player. Kind of flew under my radar as well in terms of predicting which midfielders might perform, especially from a Spanish perspective, because a lot of people might have thought Rodri would have been the focal point, but he's more defensive, so ultimately Fabian Ruiz stepping up in that attacking midfield role truly is a testament to how Spain has built. Now, switching over from Spain to France in terms of midfielders, we're going to talk much more about that defensive midfield role for France because this guy has been doing it for so long, and I feel like we failed to respect him this tournament just because he moved away from a high-profile club to Saudi Arabia this season, and we just haven't heard enough about him, and that is N'Golo Kanté. 90.89 pass accuracy. He's played 513 minutes, 85 per match. That's fantastic for someone of his age. Completed 292 of his 318 passes. So, a lot of questions surrounded the reason why Deschamps brought in a guy like N'Golo Kanté when he could have relied on younger talents, Eduardo Camavinga and his versatility. Aurélien Tchouameni could have stepped in to that defensive midfield role instead of playing a hybrid role. But he stuck with N'Golo Kanté, and his presence rang true for France. I think that a lot of punditry didn't necessarily appreciate the fact that France were relying on a midfielder who's known for his off-the-ball prowess more than in transition. But that's just not what N'Golo Kante does. He's a metronomic presence who stands the test of time in any team you put him in. And so I don't see the reason why so many people were skeptical of N'Golo Kante, because he's someone you can trust. And overall, the narrative of this game showed where football could be heading and why it's important to have a team like Spain at this tournament. Luis de la Fuente has done a fantastic job just allowing the Spaniards to have freedom in how they play and how they create opportunities, whereas Deschamps is realizing that perhaps this transition to more defensive-minded international football can really benefit this French team in terms of not being too Mbappe-centric and Griezmann-centric as we've seen in this tournament. Ultimately, it fell up short for them, but I really thought this game showed the contrast between what international football can be, especially in a time where a lot of managers are getting concerned with how modern football is going to look. I really believe that this game shaped the narrative of that conversation very well. Ultimately, the players that I mentioned, seeing how two Spaniards that I chose were attacking players and two French players that I chose were more defensive-minded, it's really going to be the question of what do you do with these players in a very congested system. And so ultimately, I think that this game, I'm very happy, played out the way that it did, because it showed the different dichotomies of what international football is going to become. But this is just about do it for this Euros midweek recap. Coming up next on the show, we're going to be looking at the 2024 NHL draft class and seeing which rookies, especially guys like Celebrini and Lev Shadov, can impact their new teams. We're going to find out more about them on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast as soon as we come back from the break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody...
Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are just about to get into our only fantasy hockey segment of the day, but before we do that, I do want to remind you guys yet again to, if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole, so anything you leave is greatly appreciated. But let's jump right into our only fantasy hockey segment of the day, and it should be a good one. I think that this 2024 NHL draft class is very interesting to look at because they're more developmental prospects than, say, generational superstars. And the thing that what makes hockey so special is that you have drafts where you can immediately see the generational talent and how they can fit scheme-wise into different teams. But drafts like these really prove that hockey is a very developmental sport. You can't just throw 18 and 19-year-olds out onto the ice and expect them to skate at a high level all of the time. And so looking at this draft class, analyzing this draft class, I'm very intrigued to see how all of these players pan out, especially those who are on the younger side, due to the fact they're not necessarily as well polished as players in past drafts. And so, without further ado, let's jump right into the rookies, who I believe will positively impact your fantasy season and the upcoming NHL season in a good manner. Starting off with our number 1 overall pick, Macklin Celebrini, going to the San Jose Sharks. Boy, do they desperately look like they need help. But Macklin Celebrini looks like a player who, if anyone in this draft class is most NHL ready, he looks like a star. People are discussing his role in the Sharks already. And the Sharks are an interesting team to analyze as well because of the fact they feel as if they're a team that's trying to live in the past with some of the players they have, like Logan Couture. They brought back Barclay Goodrow to kind of add the defensive depth at the center and wing positions. And they have a guy, Mikael Granlund, who's been there, done that, but he doesn't really fit the profile of a high-level center and skater. So Macklin Celebrini, the young center, comes into the Sharks kind of to add that dynamism to that forward line, because as this Sharks team is looking to rebuild and retool, they need someone who just has that younger energy to them, because the Sharks are still living off of the early 2010s. They were making runs to the Stanley Cup Final. They had guys like Joe Pavelski, Thornton, Burns, more defensive identity, right? And so going out drafting Macklin Celebrini, number 1 overall, proves that A, they're done living in the past, they're done focusing on building around a more defensive identity, and B, they realize they need a young face to this team, because right now, Logan Couture being one of your top profile centers is not it right now. In terms of fantasy, I think Macklin Celebrini can compete to be one of the top rookie centers in this class right away in terms of where you draft him in fantasy. I think a 60-point season is not out of the question. He's a very versatile player, and surrounded by experienced top-line players will help him. And it's not far-fetched to think that on a team of role players and vets, Macklin Celebrini can be a focal point. I know it's kind of dangerous to place that weight on a young player, especially a young teenager, at this level of competition, but Macklin Celebrini looks like he could handle it. Now, in terms of where he is as kind of a prospect, both as a rookie and fantasy, he's no Connor Bedard. Connor Bedard, he was seen as a very high-profile player, kind of a rung below McDavid's of the world, the generational talents, but Bedard was right in that middle tier of between solid top-line player and then a crazy good generational talent like Connor McDavid. So Macklin Celebrini is kind of in the middle range with Bedard, but seen kind of as someone who's not going to be responsible to carry as much of the load as a Connor Bedard. However, he's viewed to have a top 6 role, so make of that what you will. Because if you're drafting someone in fantasy who's on a team like the Sharks, who's not projected to be a contender for at least several more years, you have to consider the fact that at least one of their players is going to have a tremendous season due to their ineptitudes in certain areas. And so I feel like Macklin Celebrini is going to be that guy. I truly think that having a younger, energetic center will really revitalize this team. It might help both Celebrini and Couture to have each other, because Couture is now towards the tail end of his career, and it's not looking like he's going to be that high profile. But for now, Celebrini looks very much like the number 1 fantasy prospect in this class. Now let's move to a different profile player, Artyom Levshunov, going to the Blackhawks. And the Blackhawks are also another weird team, especially in the defensive area that Levshunov will step into. He is a solid defender. They expect him to play early and often in terms of the power play unit. He's getting a lot of Victor Hedman comparisons, very physical style. And the Blackhawks definitely are one of those teams who's also in rebuilding mode. And trying to build defensively as well, because they already have a young star on the offensive side of the ice in terms of Philip Kurashev, and now they're trying to bolster an aging defense, whereas the Sharks and Celebrini are a perfect fit. It seems like Levshunov and the Blackhawks also make perfect sense, because right now I'm looking at the depth in the Blackhawks defense, and it's a lot of veteran guys. You have a guy in TJ Brody who never truly was one of the better defenders. He was a Calgary Flame for a while, and he got bounced around the league, finds himself in Chicago. And you have a guy in Seth Jones who was a very high-profile defender as a Columbus Blue Jacket, but now looking like he is at the tail end of his career trying to get back to his status as a Columbus Blue Jacket. And you have a guy who I think is going to be the best defender in this crop, at least for next year, Alec Martinez, who is a veteran. He was a Vegas Golden Knight. We know he was a huge part of their Stanley Cup runs in their defensive structure. But now it certainly feels like Artyom Levshunov is stepping into a defensive room that looks like it's going to help him and benefit him more than it's going to play well around him. And while it's a good thing, I do believe that as a young defenseman, especially in hockey, when you're on a team that really, really believes you can help them make an impact, it's going to be a ton of pressure to see how he fits with guys who've been there and done that, because as a team like the Blackhawks, you know what success looks like, but you also know that you know what experience looks like, and you know what experience looks like when it ages. And going out and making these moves for these guys like Brody, Jones, and Martinez, while could be seen to be shrewd, can also be a detriment to seeing what you have in Levshunov. And I think that's what, at this point in time, the Blackhawks really need to do. I feel like they need to immediately shepherd Levshunov into a first defensive unit, see how he does in the power play units, see how he melds with an experienced core before deciding the future of some of these players. I say that Martinez is the most likely fit along with Levshunov in that top defensive pairing, mainly due to the fact that Alec Martinez still has it. But we'll have to see, because right now, defensemen are much harder to gauge than centers and left wingers in terms of fantasy. If there's one silver lining to any of this, though, it's that Levshunov will be strong in the power play, as they immediately see him as someone who can bolster that unit. But in terms of those top two picks, you have two very different guys, very different positions, very different aspects that they can affect in terms of fantasy. One is going to be a point scorer, the other very much going to be a hit-dominant, power play, plus-minus kind of guy. Now for a player who, outside of the top two, I think is going to shine, because he's on a team that definitely looks like it's ready to take the next step towards being a contender in Anaheim. Bennett Senecki. He's a right winger going to the Ducks at number 13 overall. Big, physical, strong profile that he brings to the Anaheim Ducks. And the Anaheim Ducks, top 6 players, definitely are starting to get the feel at least a playoff contender. We have Trevor Zegras, the young center who is capable of highlight real moments, video game numbers. You have Troy Terry, another guy who's having breakout seasons up the wazoo. You have Alex Killorn, that experienced, wily veteran who's seen it all, been on a couple of Stanley Cup Finals teams. And so, looking at this Ducks top 6 or 7, you're getting a lot of guys who are still young, still have the ability to create that attacking verve that a team always looks for. And in a crowded Western Conference, that's going to matter. Your attack is definitely going to matter in terms of how you're going to perform in this Western Conference. And so I really like what the Anaheim Ducks did with the pick. People might be skeptical, saying that they might not need as much offensive top-line depth as people might think, but Senecki definitely brings a nice profile. He's not necessarily a goal scorer, but he's someone who can be a quote-unquote goon in a sense. And while you're not going to score goals, you're going to get a lot of hits. He's going to get a lot of good plus-minus. He's going to be very effective in terms of the face-off, very aggressive in terms of the forecheck. And that profile certainly can translate to certain fantasy leagues, especially if you're playing in points or categories leagues in fantasy hockey. But that should just about do it for the segment. Hope you guys enjoyed this little deep dive into the 2024 NHL draft class. It's definitely looking to be like a very interesting prospective class. Hopefully you guys can take something away from that. But coming up next, we'll be dissecting the DeMar DeRozan trade to the Sacramento Kings. How will that affect the Western Conference and the Kings as a team overall? We'll be right back to discuss that on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely...
Hello everyone and welcome back again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the first two segments because I really love talking about two different sports that don't get the respect they deserve in terms of the fantasy landscape. But we are now transitioning to the more familiar world of fantasy basketball as we are about to dissect a brilliant trade in terms of offensive output for the Sacramento Kings. Only makes them one of the more dangerous offensive threats in the Western Conference. They, of course, added DeMar DeRozan to the mix. And seeing as to how the Sacramento Kings already have a fascinating offensive structure with a guy like Domantas Sabonis, who's very intriguing in terms of his profile as a center by playing as if he's almost a small forward or power forward. Then you have guys like De'Aaron Fox and Malik Monk who are coming into their own in the league and are top 30 fantasy players in their own right. Keegan Murray is going to continue to grow. He's a solid player from Iowa out of a couple of draft classes ago who's going to fit very well into this offensive scheme. But they ultimately swing for the fences, get a guy in DeMar DeRozan who had a fantastic, solid season last year, and is looking to add a lot more depth and experience to an already potent offense. So without further ado, let's jump into what makes this trade so intriguing, both positively and negatively, and in terms of fantasy implications. So last year, DeMar DeRozan had a very nice year for a player at the shooting guard, point guard mold. 24 points per game, 4.3 rebounds, 5.3 assists, solid stat line. Now, moving to the Kings, you're going to have to concede something in offense, perhaps, to make this work. Because Sabonis is always going to be a guy who's going to get his triple-double no matter what. He's going to be aggressive on the boards. He's going to be fantastic distributing the ball. And he's going to be fantastic putting the ball into the net. He had over 20 triple-doubles last year. So, as we can see, he's definitely one of those centers who fits the mold of the modern NBA center. He's not going to shy away from living in the paint, but also extending the floor and spacing the floor. Sabonis is perhaps the biggest focal point that the Kings wish to focus on in their offense. Then you have a guy in De'Aaron Fox who's capable of putting up 40 on any given night. He's a top 30 fantasy player, like I said, in his own right. He's only going to become a much better point guard as the Sacramento Kings figure out how they're going to space everything out. And then you have Malik Monk, who's an aggressive kind of driver of a player, likes getting to the rim, likes elevating himself to that level. And so it's going to be an interesting fit because in terms of what I see in terms of the Kings' offense, a lot of shot creation. A lot of people who can space the floor, get different looks for different players. You now add DeRozan to the mix. He's going to be fantastic in the mid-range, fantastic in distributing the ball to Sabonis. Then you have De'Aaron Fox, who may have to concede some of those 40-point nights in order for the Kings' offense as a whole to work even better than it has already. They all have different flaws, but what I love about this team is that they just have enough perimeter shooters now to fit the mold of a modern NBA offense. They have a guy in Kevin Huerter off the bench who's a nice perimeter shooter. De'Aaron Fox himself is a solid shooter. And now you add a guy who adds depth, not just focusing on 3 and D, but, getting to the mid-range spots and getting good looks from there. So overall, I'm not as concerned about what the Kings look like on offense going forward. What I am concerned about is the Kings' defensive profile, because DeMar DeRozan doesn't add any length or versatility to this squad. He doesn't switch onto bigger defenders. He's entering kind of the peak of his career. We're past the peak of his career. He's going to be a liability on the defensive side of the ball. And while I think this move can work because the Kings more often than not are going to look to outscore opponents rather than really focus on any sort of defensive identity, and it can work in the Western Conference where you're going to get into a lot of shootouts with these younger teams. The big question is, how much of a liability is that going to be in terms of fantasy? Because right now, Sabonis mitigates for his poor defense not fitting the true center mold of years past, where he's going to always get his triple-double. But at some point, something has to give in terms of how the Sacramento Kings are going to defend teams in transition, because the Western Conference is certainly looking to be the better conference for years to come. Yes, the Celtics won the championship. The Sixers just traded for Paul George. But the Western Conference, right now, is very top-heavy. And I can't say the same about the East because of the fact that there's such a different mindset in the East. The West, now that all of these bad teams have gotten the young stars they feel that can help them, it's going to be very competitive. And the Kings are definitely in the mix. I definitely think they're in the mix. They'll always be in the mix. And it's seeing the odds. They're not necessarily in the middle of the pack. I would say around 7th to 8th in terms of winning the Western Conference in betting odds. But it's all going to hinge on how you set up defensively. Because let's say the Kings are facing a Thunder team who have a lot of length, have a lot of excitement, and are willing to get very gritty. Yes, they can put up points on offense, but they're also lengthy with guys like Chet Holmgren, a fantastic defensive presence, a fantastic rim protector. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, not necessarily known for his defensive game, but solid enough. You have guys like Jalen Williams. So that's what I'm saying with the Kings. By making a move for an older guy who tends to create his own shot is good and all, because it varies this Kings offense to the point where you have production at every level of the half court in terms of Sabonis in the paint, DeRozan at the mid-range, and De'Aaron Fox, Malik Monk, and Kevin Huerter from deep. But right now, that's the caveat. You can rely on DeRozan, Fox, Sabonis as a good solid core 3 players who you're looking from the Kings for your fantasy team. But as a team sport, basketball really allows you to dig deep into both ends of the court. And while steals and blocks right now are kind of touchy subject in how you determine a player's strengths in fantasy, it's certainly very important to take into account, because not every day in this NBA specifically are you going to have a guy who's set to have about 3 to 5 steals or blocks a game, or stocks as we like to call them in the fantasy realm. On a Kings team that's looking to contend, and in fantasy terms, when you have so much offensive talent on one team, concerns have to be rising about what they can offer you on the defensive side, because that's what can swing a fantasy game. If you're in a tight fantasy game, especially in, say, an ESPN league where all the fantasy points are accrued from what your player does on any given night, you could be looking at the difference between a 35 to 40 point performance and a 45 to 50 point performance in terms of fantasy on the defensive end. I'm not saying that, the Kings can't figure something out, because the Western Conference is a crapshoot, and there are going to be days when certain teams are off their game. And so you can look to kind of revolve around hope and optimism that your defense will improve should some Western Conference teams slip up. But that's not the best way to determine your defensive structure, because I'm looking at this Kings team and saying, boy, do I love this offense, but this defense could be a joke, because I really think that in terms of this off-season trade market, some teams are making moves that in hindsight make sense in many facets, but not very one important one, and that's what could trip people up in terms of deciphering the Kings as a fantasy prospect. And right now, I love the look of this offense. It's going to be consistent, but right now, I can't say the same about the defense, which could really hurt and be a detriment in terms of fantasy. But that should just about do it for this dissection of the DeMar DeRozan trade. Coming next, we'll be transitioning to our player profiles with two boomer bust guys, starting off with the Steelers tight end, who certainly looks like he could be in for a breakout season due to the inabilities of the Steelers wide receiver room. We'll be right back to discuss him on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you liked that last segment. I'm really intrigued about all these off-season trades going on in the NBA and how they could affect teams fantasy-wise. But we are transitioning to the world of fantasy football, continuing with our player profiles with two guys who are very high-ceiling, low-floor type players. Two guys in two offenses that are looking for some modicum of production from their offensive skill positions, and so they could potentially have fantastic years in fantasy, but they could also prove to be busts because of the ineptitudes of the respective players around them. Without further ado, let's jump right into the first one, starting off with the Steelers tight end, who certainly has the feel of someone who can be one of those tight ends to be a force to be reckoned with, kind of going under the radar in terms of how people view him. It's not entirely his fault. I think it's mainly the fault of the Steelers for not finding certain pieces that fit their offense, and that is Pat Freiermuth. I love Pat Freiermuth more than other people expect because of the fact that right now the Steelers look like an unknown commodity. They do have George Pickens, who's a fantastic receiver, fantastic in terms of expected catch rate, fantastic in terms of contested catches, truly a number one wide receiver who the Pittsburgh Steelers should be thanking. But right now, in order to compete in the division they're in, and especially in the AFC, they need variance. That's what I saw last year in terms of the Steelers' offense. There was no variance. You can chalk that up to perhaps Matt Canada being a very, very, very disappointing offensive coordinator, beyond disappointing even, and Kenny Pickett not adjusting to the system. But now I feel there's a little bit more expectation. The Steelers, they bring in 2 QBs in Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. Gonna be interesting to see if one of them wins the starting job outright or it's more of a platoon system, but because that could add to what people think of the consistency of the Steelers offense. But right now, the Steelers are holding out for a hero outside of George Pickens. And why not have it be Pat Freiermuth, who's a tight end who, in a system that could work for him, is going to see a lot of targets. And so without further ado, let's jump right into what I believe people are missing in Pat Freiermuth and what he needs to do to truly become one of the premier tight ends in fantasy. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 221.7 fantasy points. His best season was actually his rookie year, where he accumulated 91.7 fantasy points. Last year, though, was kind of a disappointing down year, and it could be attributable to the ineptitude of the Steelers' offense, the decisions they made, but he did only average 6.4 PPR points per game in terms of last year. And also in terms of, catches and touchdowns in the red zone, he wasn't performing. In fact, his rookie season in 2022 was his best season. 17 catches as a rookie, only 2 in the years prior to that. And so I feel like Pat Freiermuth right now is one of those guys who is just waiting on the precipice. He sees different tight ends around the league around him, like guys like Sam Laporta, who's already vaulted into the stratosphere, and he's a rookie. He's seeing guys like Trey McBride, who's also poised to be a hidden gem at the fantasy tight end position. And then he also sees the old guard with guys like Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, and George Kittle. And Pat Freiermuth is trying to carve a mold for himself in someone's image there. And Pat Freiermuth is right in the middle. He's kind of the fork in the road in terms of the tight ends you can take in terms of fantasy. Because he hasn't necessarily been consistent enough to be one of the newer guys in the league to potentially be among the Sam Laportas and Trey McBrides. But he's also not fantastic enough, definitely not fantastic enough to be the Travis Kelce's and George Kittles of the world. And so this is a make or break year for how the Steelers view Pat Freiermuth in their offense. And from what fantasy odds are projecting for him, it could be a nice little year for him, but not one you would expect out of someone who I'm so high on. 563 yards, 4 touchdowns for a total of 82.6 fantasy points. So not necessarily the best, not necessarily the worst by any means, but still kind of in that median range for tight ends. Now, let's look at how Pat Freiermuth might look in this offense. Obviously, I still fear it's going to be an element of Pickens or bust to this offense, and it could lead to the detriment, especially if Russell Wilson is the quarterback, because as we saw in Denver, Russell Wilson became too reliant on Cortland Sutton to make incredible catches, and no other Denver Broncos wide receiver or tight end truly stepped up. That being said, Russell Wilson is one of those quarterbacks in his career who really has utilized his tight ends to the best of their abilities. We saw it in Seattle, where he truly created a culture that utilized every single weapon they had. They didn't necessarily have high-profile weapons, but Russell Wilson made do with what he had. You saw guys like Will Tukuafu. You saw guys like Will Disley become bigger roles in that Seattle offense. And then transitioning to Denver, he never really had a consistent tight end in his years there, but like Andrew Beck, Greg Dulcich had decent seasons under Russell Wilson's tutelage. And so transitioning to a Pittsburgh Steelers offense who right now doesn't have that many options outside of both Pickens and Freiermuth, I really think that Russell Wilson's going to say, hey, I don't want to have a repeat of what happened in Denver where I'm reliant on one receiver to make these incredible catches. I'm going to pass this young tight end who I think is becoming a cult hero in Pittsburgh. So I really believe that should Russell Wilson be the guy going forward, Pat Freiermuth is primed for a breakout year. And also, it can't be worse than what Matt Canada did with this offense. I think there's going to be more variance. I think Pat Freiermuth is going to find himself in a lot more different roles, whether it's a run blocker, pass blocker, something of that nature. He's going to be someone who is going to continue to develop, and that's where I think the needle will be pushed with him to the kind of zone of up-and-coming tight ends, because right now, I'm sitting here telling you that Pat Freiermuth can have a breakout year. And for all intents and purposes, if Russell Wilson's a quarterback and he's looking for a second option, he's going to be the guy. But right now, there's a reason he's in that median. And like I said, who knows if anything would have been different had Matt Canada not been the OC of Pittsburgh for the past couple of years. Who knows if, say, the Steelers had not chosen Kenny Pickett and they went into a Mitch Trubisky, who's a very timing-based quarterback. Who knows in the future whether or not Mike Tomlin will be the head coach, because he's certainly hanging by a thread. He can't keep on milking this roster for wins, trying to conjure up magic, because let me tell you, a large part of what Pat Freiermuth's fantasy season is going to look like is going to come down to the quarterback play, and sense that Russell Wilson will feel like there's no other option outside of George Pickens and him on the roster. But it's also going to come down to how they play in the AFC North, because this is a division that, is going to be very competitive. The Steelers are not going to be the top dogs in this division. In fact, they might be the last place team, and so they're going to have to figure out ways to find out who's going to be the offensive star quickly, because I can't see a path forward where George Pickens can be the only person producing. They have Najee Harris still, but he's been rapidly declining. They lose Jalen Warren. They lose Deontay Johnson, like I said. No more Chase Claypool. So it's really these two guys right here, Pickens and Freiermuth. And in a tight end landscape that's going to get very tight, where a lot of good tight ends are either going to get drafted, undrafted, or overvalued and undervalued, Pat Freiermuth, like I said, is going to be that median guy. He's either going to have a breakout year, and I look fantastic for doing this segment, or he's going to be a huge disappointment, and this segment is all for naught. But I truly believe in him, especially having the experience of Russell Wilson at the QB position, knowing that it is what it is with the Steelers in terms of their offensive weapons. That's what just about do it with this segment. Coming up next, we transition from tight end to running back, where we have another guy who's going to be entrusted with a lot of the workload in a Patriots offense that really is kind of reeling here. We'll be right back with that segment to close out the show on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast when we come back. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the last segment of today's show on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I hope you guys enjoy that last player profile, the kind of boomer bust nature of a guy like Pat Freiermuth, because we're continuing that narrative, switching over from the Steelers to the Patriots, from the tight end position to the running back position, where you have a guy who's gonna be entrusted with a lot of the workload as the Patriots try to find some success, some iota of success at the offensive side of the ball in terms of how they play. Without further ado, let's jump right into the fantasy player profile of Ramondre Stevenson. Now, Ramondre Stevenson actually embodies boomer bust, because coming into the league, he looked like he was going to be a superstar, but last year, fate of circumstance led to him not having as good a year as people thought he was going to do. But it certainly looks like he's going to get a lot of touches in a Patriots offense that really has no source of optimism, kind of unlike the Steelers, who at least have George Pickens and can say they have a top-end receiver. The Patriots just have a conglomeration of role players. So without further ado, let's jump right into why Ramondre Stevenson is primed for a big season, or it could all fade into obscurity. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 388.7 fantasy points. His best season was in 2022 with 180.1 fantasy points. So as you can see, fantastic start to his career. He was the running back 10 in 2022, 186 yards per game. But last year, as we all know, kind of got caught up in the rapture of this very inept Patriots offense. Running back 27 last year, only 71.4 yards per game. However, if there was any upside to what the last season could tell us about how he's going to transition to this season, when he could be even a bigger role, in weeks 1 through 8, he was 33rd in missed tackles out of 34 running backs, and 38th in yards after contact. From weeks 9 to 13, he only played in 13 games. Injury concerns is another one of those things as to why he might not have a breakout season again. 13th in missed tackles, 3rd in yards after contact. And so, I'm really intrigued to see whether or not Ramondre Stevenson will be relied upon a lot more than people think. Because, in terms of fantasy projections, he's only projected to have 783 yards for 5 touchdowns and 144.1 fantasy points. So, not terrible, but not necessarily the standard you want at the QB position. The running back position. In terms of the QB position, and Drake May and how he transitions to the NFL, that's going to be a very important factor, because Drake May, in terms of player profile, could be one of those more jittery rookie QBs who doesn't really settle into the system right away. A lot of skepticism surrounding him stems from, his footwork, his accuracy, what he can do outside of structure, and so I really think he's going to lean on Ramondre Stevenson a lot. And looking at this wide receiver core, there isn't much to talk about. It's kind of like a what-if scenario. What if, they had gotten Deebo Samuel in 2019 instead of N'Keal Harry? What if they had gotten George Pickens instead of Tyquan Thornton in 2022? And now they're left with all these different role players with no true identity to what they can do or what they represent. And so you're stuck with guys like the Mario Douglas, Kendrick Bourne, Juju Smith-Schuster, who was disappointed. His snaps were reeked with injuries. And right now, the only productive players who I can think about on this Patriots roster are Ramondre Stevenson and Hunter Henry, who are both coming off very disappointing years. And right now, there is no sense that any source of excitement stems from this Patriots offense. There's no one that eye-catching right now that can help supplement Drake May outside of Ramondre Stevenson. Yes, you have Jalen Polk, who could be an interesting prospect to develop. Very underrated player, kind of overshadowed in that wide receiver room at the University of Washington. But there are also reasons as to why he doesn't necessarily strike you immediately. He only went a 4.5 plus 40. And then you have a guy in Javon Baker who was a 4th rounder, who's also kind of in that same profile. So just reading all these names, there's no one I can pinpoint and say, ooh, Drake May should be excited by that player. And right now, I'm going to keep on sounding repetitive. Ramondre Stevenson is the most appealing name. Now, they did bring in Antonio Gibson to kind of help bolster that backfield. He is a nice addition from the Washington Commanders. Never truly a running back one kind of player in that Washington Commanders system. Definitely developed into more of a supplemental role in his career. And so adding him really doesn't threaten the hierarchy that I see in that running back room. So for all intents and purposes, Ramondre Stevenson is going to be the workhorse. And for better or worse, that's perhaps what he needs to get back to what he was before, all these injuries happened and all these Patriots players ended up not working out. I really think that by being a focal point of the offense, Ramondre Stevenson can be like, hey, they value me, so I'm going to do the best I can to help this young offense who right now looks very directionless, exceed expectations. And that has to stand for something. Because when you're in two offenses, like I mentioned with Pat Freiermuth and the Steelers and Patriots, who have very little in terms of escape routes and get out of jail free cards on their offense, so to speak, you need a guy who's going to step up and say, hey, this team is struggling. We have a guy coming in at the quarterback position who's not as polished as some other rookies, not as polished definitely as some of these veterans who are going to be facing in the AFC East. I need to be the focal point. I need to help my guy establish himself in the league. In order to do that, I need to step up. And that could be Ramondre Stevenson. And I think he's very willing as well. He's not a guy who, in my mind at the very least, strikes me as an explosive guy after contact, which is why those missed tackles and yards after contact numbers are very promising, because he definitely is a more bell cow type of running back and not someone you would expect to go off for 30 or 40 yards in certain situations. So the balance of how Ramondre Stevenson's season is going to go is very reminiscent of Pat Freiermuth. And I'm really excited that I get to break down two players who are not as high profile as some of the others I discussed, because these are two guys on middling teams, middling offenses, who have to become the escape routes. And it's up to them and how these offenses set up around new quarterbacks, Russell Wilson in Pittsburgh and Drake May in New England. Very different players as well, to get the most out of what these offenses has to offer. And thus, Ramondre Stevenson and Pat Freiermuth, in terms of their economy, really represent an intriguing fantasy market. You go with two guys who I'm talking to you about now, who right now fit the mold of potential breakout players because of the circumstances of their offenses? Or do you stick with the status quo? The fact that I'm presenting these two guys to you proves that I think they have longevity, but it remains to be seen. But that will just about do it for this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you like the show. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network itself. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. We'll be back better than ever tomorrow on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast with another fantastic show. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in.